Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are today. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. I am Amy Barris. I'm the Executive Director of the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. If you're not too familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization that works to advance employee ownership across Colorado through education and technical assistance to businesses to become employee-owned. And we're really excited today to be hosting this webinar on employee ownership. How does it work, and what are your options if you're thinking about employee ownership? We have with us Susan Halevi, who will be presenting, and I'm going to turn it over to Susan to introduce herself. And then after that, I'll go over just a couple of logistics before we launch into the presentation.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Amy, for that introduction and for hosting this webinar. I am with SES ESOP Strategies and with the Stevens and Lee law firm, and we work primarily on ESOPs. We assist companies in establishing ESOPs. We work with companies who have ESOPs and may be involved in transactions. We also represent ESOP trustees, and we're very fortunate because we have among us attorneys who also work in the co-op world, and some of us who came to employee ownership through the co-op world. I worked for a while for the Cooperative Loan Fund of New England, where I'm based. We also were asked by the ICA group to work on a purpose trust. And we helped launch a purpose trust that we'll be talking about at the end of this presentation. So we have unusual breadth across the employee ownership world, and I'm really delighted to be able to, in this webinar, to cover that terrain with you.
Great, thanks, Susan. So just a couple of logistics. If you're participating today, your mic will be muted, but hopefully you can hear us all right. But Susan will be going through her presentation, and if you have questions as she's presenting, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a tab that says Q&A. If you click on that, you can type in your questions in that Q&A box. We'll be compiling questions, and at the end there will be time for Susan to answer questions that come up. We'll try to answer all of them if we can, and if we run out of time, we'll be sort of prioritizing and reordering and trying to get to everybody that we can. So, but please feel free to, as you have a question, go ahead and type it into that Q&A box, and it will come to us. So we'll go ahead and get started.
All right, so first an overview of a little roadmap of where we're going in this webinar. We'll look at the benefits of employee ownership and some features of ownership. People talk about ownership, but we rarely stop and say, well, what does it mean to be an owner? What can owners do? What rights do owners have? And what does that look like in the context of employee ownership? And then we'll look at some ownership structures. The benefits of employee ownership. The employee owners have a stake in the company's success, and there's a general consensus that makes a difference. What the research shows is that it's ownership plus employee engagement that makes it the biggest difference for the company and the employees. And engagement may already be part of a company's culture when they transition to employee ownership, or it may be something that they develop over time. And there are advisors and facilitators who can help a company increase the level of employee engagement. There's evidence of increased productivity and profits for the company. There are data that show that employee-owned companies had fewer layoffs in the past 2 recessions. And when you look at the impact for employees, in ESOP companies going all the way back to 1974, when the first ESOP companies came into being, through 2014, the average worker received $134,000 in wealth from company stock. NCEO did a terrific report that they published in 2017, looking at employee owners long before retirement, ages 28 to 34, and found that they have 92% higher median household wealth, 33% higher income from wages, and 53% longer median job tenure. So what do we mean when we talk about ownership? What is ownership? Well, by state law, owners vote. If you look at a corporation, owners vote for the directors. They elect the directors, and it's the directors who set the policy. Shareholders also have the right to vote on certain actions by state law, and what that varies from state to state, but just generally, it's going to be things like amending the articles, reorganization of the company, dissolution, sales of substantially all assets. There's certain fundamental existential events in a company's life where state law generally provides the right for shareholders to have a direct say. Voting in a corporation is usually based on the number of shares owned, but that can be different according to the bylaws. Owners receive information about a company. They receive a share of the profits in the form of dividends or distributions, and owners have the right to transfer the stock that they own, subject to any restrictions that may apply, or to sell the company and receive the appreciation in the value of the company, the value of their shares of stock. So that's what we mean when we think about ownership on an individual level as an individual shareholder of a corporation. How do those features or some of those features show up in an employee-owned company? Let's look, for example, very, very important. So we're going to look at some very key fundamental features of ownership: voting rights, information, and economic benefit. So voting rights and information for employee owners, it looks different if you look at an ESOP, a co-op, or a company owned by a purpose trust. In an ESOP, the trustee is the shareholder of the shares that have been purchased by the trustee and are held in the ESOP trust. So any statutory rights to vote that pertain to shareholders, the trustee exercises those rights. However, subject to very important caveat, participants in the ESOP have what's called pass-through votes on certain actions. The ESOP may provide even greater voting rights, pass-through voting rights for the participants, but it's not required to do so. So you can have a democratic ESOP, but you're not required to have a democratic ESOP. And the pass-through votes, which are required, have to do with merger and consolidation, recapitalization or reclassification, liquidation or dissolution, or a sale of substantially all assets. Again, key existential issues for the company. ESOP participants are required to receive statements showing the value of their shares of company stock, but they're not required to receive company financials. However, an ESOP company may choose to do open book management, for example, and provide more information. So there's flexibility there within the parameters or beyond the parameters of what's required. And the co-op is very different because the members vote democratically, one person, one vote, not in proportion to their ownership. And sharing information is a fundamental co-op principle. Companies owned by a purpose trust may include employees in deciding how the trustee votes the shares. Again, those shares are held in trust, so it's the trustee that's the legal shareholder. And they may share information with employees, but it's a different scenario because there are no legal requirements that they do so. How do employee owners share in profits or the appreciated value of the company? ESOP and again, very different comparing ESOPs and co-ops. ESOP participants receive the appreciated value of the company's stock and cash that's been allocated to their individual accounts within the ESOP, and they receive this as a retirement benefit. If they leave before retirement, there are provisions for rollover or payout of vested shares. If they die or they're disabled, there are provisions for distributions. But generally speaking, the ESOP is a retirement benefit plan, and so you're going to be looking at down the road appreciated value of company stock. By contrast, co-op members receive patronage dividends from net earnings. So they're receiving money from the company's net earnings as they go over the term of their employment. And when they leave the co-op, they don't get the appreciated value of their ownership interest. They get whatever balance is in their capital account, which accrues from patronage dividends. So they're very, very different ways of sharing in the profits or appreciated value. And it's not that one is better than the other. One is more suitable for a particular company than another, and that's how companies choose which path of employee ownership they're going to take. Companies of all kinds can use revenue generated by the business to fund salary increases, bonuses, and employee benefits. So now we're going to start looking at different forms of employee ownership, and I'm going to go very quickly through the first couple of slides just because of time. But these are each of these slides could be the beginning of a webinar in itself. Companies can sell stock directly to their employees. However, federal and state securities laws apply, and even where exemptions are available, the anti-fraud rules warrant substantial disclosures. There's always a risk that the employees who purchase shares may sue or complain to regulators if the value of the purchased shares declines and they believe that they haven't received adequate information. Very important question if you're selling directly to the employees, what's the market for the shares? And companies who do this often have a shareholder agreement that provides for the company to buy back the shares if the employee leaves the company, for example. One way of providing direct ownership is through an employee stock purchase plan or an ESPP. These are primarily used by public companies for exactly the reasons that we've just touched on. There's already a market for the shares if you have a public company, and the public company is already required to make disclosures about its finances and activities. So some of those concerns pertaining to direct ownership are already covered when you have a public company. Now, there are ESPPs in some private companies, and there are some companies that have found them to be a terrific way to accomplish their objectives of achieving employee ownership. And this is, so it certainly can be done. The downsides are that it doesn't have the tax advantages of something like an ESOP, and you do have these, issues to address regarding securities laws, anti-fraud disclosures, adequate information, and creating a market for the shares or a way to buy back for the shares. That said, there are companies that choose that path and really like it and have found it to be the right thing for them. These forms of equity compensation you may be familiar with from other contexts, and we're just going to name them here. Stock options, stock grants, and synthetic equity. For example, stock appreciation rights, which gives the holder the right to receive the equivalent that they would receive in the appreciation of the value of a share of stock if they owned it. Now we're going to turn and do a deeper dive into ESOPs. As I've mentioned, an ESOP is a retirement plan. That means it's subject to ERISA and also the Internal Revenue Code because the ESOP trust is tax exempt. The So some folks are, concerned that this is regulated. There's all these requirements and restrictions, but many companies have 401k plans, which are also subject to requirements and restrictions. So there are, if an ESOP is the right fit for your company, there's help in complying with the regulatory requirements and learning about it. The ESOP must invest primarily in company stock, although there are some diversification retirements for participants down the road. And the stock that's held in trust can be non-leveraged. The company can contribute stock to the ESOP or contribute cash used by the ESOP to purchase stock, or it can be leveraged, which is when stock is purchased with borrowed money. And very often when we're assisting companies in establishing ESOPs, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at some form of leverage, possibly through bank financing, possibly through seller financing. So when is an ESOP a good fit for a company? And here's some general parameters. Stable cash flow with slow to medium growth. You want that stable cash flow so that the company knows that it's going to be able to make regular contributions to the ESOP trust to pay down the ESOP loan and have shares allocated to the participants' accounts. Slow to medium growth is that stable cash flow. And also if a company has a lot of capital needs for R&D or capital expenditures, that may not be as good a fit. You have to look at the particulars for every company's situation. But generally, stable cash flow with slow to medium growth. Some debt capacity is good in order to leverage the ESOP acquisition. Very, very important to have successor management either in place or in development, say over the next 10 years or so, because an ESOP is only going to be as successful as the business. And as the founders or existing owners transition, the company needs to have some good, strong successor management in place. An ESOP acquisition will be good for owners who are willing to receive the purchase price over time, and they may want to remain involved in the business or transition their departure from the business. If there's a strategic buyer for a company offering a significant premium, that is usually very attractive to many owners. The ESOP can pay fair market value, but it can't pay more than fair market value. And there are buyers for some companies that are willing to pay a significant premium. However, we've worked with founders who leave those offers on the table because they know that if their company is sold to a strategic buyer, the office is going to be shut down. Some employees are going to be leaving. And the strategic buyer is buying for strategic reasons. The legacy of the founder's company is probably not one of those reasons. And so for owners who care a lot about legacy, an ESOP can be very attractive. Legacy meaning the future of the company, those managers who are coming up, the employees, and the community that the company is part of. How much will the ESOP pay for the stock? Fair market value, but not more. And what about transaction costs? They are significant, but they're usually lower than selling to an outside party where you need advisors and attorneys, so the costs are not small there either, and they're offset by the tax savings that come with the ESOP path. So how does an ESOP work? The company establishes an ESOP plan and trust. The trust purchases stock either from the shareholders or the company, and we'll look at two different transaction structures for that. And the purchase price is financed very often by a combination of cash, a bank loan, and a seller note. But it can be any of the above, any or all of the above. Then the company makes contributions or dividends to the ESOP that the ESOP uses to repay the acquisition loan. And as that loan is paid down, the ESOP allocates shares of stock to the employee's individual accounts. the ESOP or the company repurchases shares from employees after termination, and that's how the distributions happen. So that's a big picture overview. ESOP minimums, again, looking at is this a good fit for me? And you don't really know what's a good fit for your company until you talk to some advisors, let them take a look at your financials, and we very often do a sort of ballpark quick look. Am I in the realm of an ESOP? Then there's the feasibility study that goes more in depth and transaction analysis, really looking at what it would mean for your company, and it's different from company to company. However, people want to have some ballpark. Should I even be thinking of this? And so what we say is usually at least 15 employees, 20 is better. You need that adequate payroll to finance the ESOP loan. And what that means is contributions to the ESOP are limited, generally 25% of eligible payroll. And you want the ESOP to be able to have enough money coming in from those contributions to pay back the ESOP loan. That generally works out pretty well because the ESOP loan has a long term, but that's one threshold. And the other thing to look at is whether the tax savings are going to be sufficient to cover the transaction costs and administration expenses. So basically, if you looked at the amortization of the transaction costs over time, if you looked at the annual fees and expenses, and then multiply that by your tax rate, because those contributions and tax benefits are going to be very helpful, then you're going to see what your tax savings are and whether you can cover the transaction costs and administration expenses. I'm sorry, I misstated that. You multiply the annual contributions by the tax rate and see whether that's going to be, that tax savings is going to be sufficient to cover the transaction costs and administration expenses. Here's what a ESOP transaction looks like for a C corporation. You have the company, and in this case, we're going to look at a leveraged ESOP. So the company obtains a bank loan, and that's going to be secured by a pledge of assets. That's why it's good to have some debt capacity. And then in this case, the company is making that loan, that's the acquisition loan, to the ESOP. And the ESOP is using the proceeds of the loan to purchase shares from the shareholder. The company stock then goes into the ESOP, it's held in trust. However, it's pledged back to the company to secure the acquisition loan. And then as the company pays down the acquisition loan, those shares of stock are released into the accounts of the individual ESOP participants. And this is the chart showing the repayment. The company is making contributions, tax deductible contributions or dividends to the ESOP. And that's where a big part of your tax benefit comes in for a C corporation. And the company, the ESOP then takes that money, pays it back to the company as a loan payment on the ESOP loan. And as the loan is paid, pledged shares are allocated to the ESOP accounts. So this shows you in this scenario, there's with a $16 million purchase or a principal borrowed, there's a $3 million net tax benefit because of the deductibility of ESOP expenses. That tax savings can help finance the acquisition and maintenance of the ESOP, or it can be used for working capital purposes for expansion of the company. There's also a tax benefit to the selling shareholder or shareholders. If you're selling to a C corporation, if you're selling C corporation shares to an ESOP or to a worker co-op, there's the possibility of deferring capital gains tax and other taxes, state capital gains in most states, Medicare surtax, on the sale of those shares. If the ESOP or co-op owns at least 30% of the value of all company stock after the sale, and if the selling shareholders purchase what's called qualified replacement property, QRP, stocks and bonds of any domestic operating corporation, and there are advisors who can help structure very attractive investments, and the shareholders then have the benefit of those investments, and as long as the proceeds remain invested in QRP, they don't pay those taxes. If they are still held in QRP at the time of death, there's a step up in basis. And so no capital gains tax. And here's what it looks like in a hypothetical scenario. Again, that's for a C corporation. If you have an S corporation, there's a very different kind of tax benefit. And of course, we work with companies who are one, either C or S, and looking at converting to the other. And that can be analyzed on a case-by-case basis as you're looking at the specifics of a potential ESOP transaction. Here's a structure for an S corporation ESOP acquisition, where you have, again, a portion of the purchase price is coming from the bank, from a bank loan to the company. And a portion of the purchase price is coming from the shareholders taking subordinated notes. These are often accompanied by warrants, which helps increase the internal rate of return for the shareholders, because the note and the notes as subordinated notes have an appropriate interest rate as well. And what happens in this type of transaction is we start with the company borrowing money from the bank and then redeeming the stock of the shareholders. So you see the company stock going up to the company from the shareholders in return for some cash and subordinated notes with warrants. And then the company issues new shares to the ESOP, having made a loan to the ESOP loan. And then you have a similar structure as with the C corporation, where the ESOP pledges that stock back to the company to secure that acquisition loan. And as the company makes contributions to the ESOP and pays down that loan, the shares are released to the accounts of the employees. Another feature that we often use in ESOP transactions is to have a stock appreciation rights plan, for example, for key managers, so that they have some share in the upside of the increased value of the company without being shareholders. The S corporation tax benefits can be very attractive because the ESOP trust is tax exempt and because an S corporation is a pass-through tax entity. So when a pass-through tax entity is owned by a tax-exempt entity, the ESOP trust, it doesn't pay those income taxes at the federal level and also for many states. That makes ESOPs, and that's to the extent that the ESOP trust owns the corporation, so 100% ESOP-owned S corporation is effectively 100% income tax-free. And that, of course, frees that cash flow that would have gone to pay income taxes to pay for the cost of the ESOP, to pay for any corporate purpose. So that's part of the analysis that you're doing when you're evaluating, is an ESOP a good fit for your company? What will the projected financials look like for you? The ESOP transaction, the steps that you go through start out with a feasibility study. And I mentioned something before the feasibility study, which is talking to an advisor. And through SES, we have financial advisors, and we can look at a lot of different scenarios for a company beyond ESOPs. We can also do, and other advisors can also do, a kind of ballpark conversation. Take a look and see, are you in the ballpark? And then if you think you are, you would do a full feasibility study transaction analysis. And we do dozens of these each year. About 75% of them decide to go ahead with the transaction. And in either case, the companies fully understand or thoroughly understand what it looks like for them, and have the opportunity to look at different scenarios, to ask all the questions that they have, and really understand what it looks like, what it works, what the projections would be. And then if it's a go, you would engage the trustee team, line up financing if you're going to have a bank loan. And that valuation, some folks say, well, we just did a valuation. What do you mean there has to be another valuation? And the other valuation is for the benefit of the trustee. They have to have an independent valuation by a financial advisor to come up with their proposed purchase price for the ESOP stock purchase. You also design an ESOP plan and the necessary legal documents, and there's closing. And then after that, the company applies for a determination letter from the IRS to confirm that the ESOP is tax exempt. ESOP maintenance, going forward, you have to have an annual valuation update. There's record keeping and administration expenses. Employee communications and education is important. Legal compliance, and then planning for the repurchase obligations that the ESOP will have as employees retire. The primary concerns looking at an ESOP, will the valuation be within the range that the owners would like it to be? What's the financing package going to look like? What's the effect on the overall benefits structure and the salaries? And what are any legal or fiduciary risks? You want to understand what that means, and the level of cost and complexity providing for the repurchase obligations. If it's the right fit, there you will find your way through all of these concerns. But these are the kind of things that sometimes give people pause. And I think what that means is to ask more questions, get more information, find out what it would mean for you so that you can evaluate the concerns. So I know in Colorado and really across the country, we're looking at New Belgium Brewing Company and the sale of that great company, one of the leading employee-owned companies in the country. And New Belgium was founded in 1989, established its ESOP in 2000, became 100% employee-owned in 2012. There's 750 worker owners. They practice open book management with a high level of employee engagement, strong ownership culture, committed to environmental sustainability, certified B Corporation. Really a great company. And they found as they were growing that they had repurchase obligations coming up, and also the need for growth capital. The craft brewery industry has really taken off. There, what started out as many craft brewers, it's sort of a natural part of the market evolution that there's going to be consolidation and that there's going to be pressure on companies to look for more capital. And from what I've read, they thoroughly examined their options for how to get more money into the company and decided that this acquisition was the best path for the future of the company and for their culture, from what I've read. Looking back over the history of the ESOP, the company distributed more than $190 million to former ESOP participants, and more than 30 current participants will receive at least $100,000, and in some cases more, from the sale of the company. And Amy and I were chatting before the seminar began, is this an ESOP success or an ESOP failure? And I think, and of course, each person should think about that for themselves. I think, for me, it's in ESOP or any form of employee ownership or any of these structures that we're talking about today, only goes so far. A company is a company, and its journey, its life cycle, and its story will depend in large part on its business and its market and what's happening. And sometimes there are going to be pressures for change. So in this case, I see this as an ESOP success when I look at the strong employee culture that hopefully they will carry forward, and the financial benefits that the worker owners achieved over the life of the ESOP. Now, turning to worker cooperatives. Cooperatives are founded on the 7 co-op principles of voluntary open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy, and independence of the co-op and its relations with other entities, education, training, and information, cooperation among cooperatives, and concern for community. A worker cooperative has democratic member control. The company is owned by its members, and the qualifications for membership are determined in the bylaws, taking into account things like length of time at the company and hours worked. The members elect the board of directors on a one-person, one-vote basis. And there is an alternative, which is collective governance, where all co-op members would be board members as well. Member economic participation, we've talked about a little bit at the beginning. There's a membership fee that's set by the bylaws of the board, and it doesn't depend on share value. The patronage dividend is the distribution of part of the net earnings of the company that are allocated to members based on their patronage, and patronage is a concept from the wider world of co-ops. In the case of worker cooperatives, it's measured by the work that the worker employee contributes to the company, and there are formulae for measuring or allocating patronage that are written into the bylaws of the particular company. Members share in profits over the term of their employment, but as I mentioned, there's no share of increased company value of appreciation unless the company is sold, and in which case the bylaws determine who receives the proceeds. For example, it might be all members for the past 10 years, because as you go along, there's no participation in the appreciated value, and there would be a windfall to the employees who happen to be employees at the time the company is sold, if it's sold. So you try to figure out how to anticipate that and even that out, make that more fair. And these are some details on economic participation and how patronage is calculated. It may be based, the formula could include W-2 earnings, hours worked, seniority. Again, this is all on a company by company basis, and there's no one size fits all. Patronage dividends are paid either in cash or what's called written notices of allocation, and qualified written notices of allocation will include payment of at least 20% of the patronage dividend in cash and are deductible by the company and taxed to the member. So in that way you don't have a double taxation because of the tax deduction that the company can take. And patron dividends that are paid by written notices of allocation are added to the individual capital accounts of the members. They may accrue interest in those accounts, and the board of the bylaws determine when the accounts are redeemed. Losses are also allocated usually first to the retained earnings account, but they may also be allocated to the individual capital accounts equally or in proportion to relative patronage. And the member receives the balance in the capital account when their membership terminates. Some of the tax benefits of worker cooperatives are, as we mentioned, that Section 1042 deferral of capital gain on stock sold to worker cooperatives in a co-op conversion is available in situations that meet the requirements, and that no double taxation or company level tax of amounts paid as patronage dividends if they're paid in cash and qualified written notices of allocation. Education, training, and information are core cooperative principles, along with concern for community, and establishing a co-op generally starts with education, training, and information to build capacity to support engagement. And there's usually a considerable degree of member participation in shaping in policy and improving operations. So of course, that can be built into the bylaws for the committee structure, and it's part of a culture of a cooperative. What that looks like in a particular company depends on the culture of that particular company. The legal structure of the co-op can be there's quite a lot of choices. There's subchapter T of the Internal Revenue Code, which is specifically for cooperatives, or could be a corporation taxed under subchapter S. There are legal entities, worker cooperatives, under the state law of some states. You can have a limited liability with a cooperative operating agreement. That would include worker ownership, membership requirements, democratic governance, allocation of net earnings. You can design that all into the LLC agreement, which is very flexible. One caveat, it's also easier for future members to change. But again, this is all on a company-by-company basis. So you work with advisors to figure out what's a good fit for your company financially and from the point of view of its culture. State law may restrict what type of company can use the word cooperative in its name, so there may actually be more cooperatives than we're aware of because they may include companies that can't use that word in their name. In terms of financing a cooperative, again, you have to be aware of the application of securities laws because any offer or sale of stock or debt instruments is subject to federal and state securities laws. Some cooperative shares are not securities because they're not investments for profit, and there are some specific exemptions that are available for co-ops in certain situations. Other exemptions may be available, as they would be for any company, for preferred stock or debt offerings, for example, on sales to accredited investors or the interstate offerings exemptions. But again, remember always the anti-fraud rules apply even if there's an exemption from registration. So this is definitely an area where you want to be talking with legal counsel. Sources of funds for financing a worker cooperative or a cooperative conversion, a company that's going to become a worker cooperative, include membership fees, retained earnings, preferred stock. A co-op can issue preferred stock subject to applicable restrictions. There's some restrictions under subchapter T and sometimes by state law. You can get bank loans, particularly if a bank knows co-ops and how they're financed, what their books look like. Community loan funds or CDFIs. Sometimes there are community loan funds that are dedicated to co-ops. And social impact investors may be available for your co-op. Some co-ops have had a lot of success with member and community loan campaigns the River Valley Food Co-op back in Massachusetts has just completed a very successful loan campaign to help finance a new store that they're opening. And crowdfunding is a new form of funds. It's subject to a lot of caveats, but some co-ops have used that as well. Again, work with financial advisors, consult legal counsel, figure out what's right and what the requirements are in your situation. There are 3 paths to co-op conversion. Generally, an existing co-op or LLC can convert to a worker co-op by amending its charter documents or operating agreement, or you can create a new co-op entity to purchase the stock of the existing company and merge it into the co-op, or to purchase the assets. And here's some notes on finance. And again, it's going to sound familiar: cash loans and or seller notes, or possibly the issuance of preferred stock. And what happens to the sellers, in particular, if you have a seller finance transaction? This can be similar in ESOPs and co-ops. The sellers may serve on the board of directors until their purchase price is paid in full. And in a co-op scenario, they might have a supermajority vote, or a vote or a veto for major decisions. That again is for co-ops. And here are the basic steps for forming a co-op. You would start generally with worker engagement and educational trainings, and then form a steering committee to explore and assess the possibilities, discuss the structure, obtain input from all the workers, and then do a feasibility assessment, financial and operational. We're usually working with advisors on that. Valuation of the company, because you need to know what are those shares going to cost. Offering statement for the employees, a vote to convert, document, and close the transaction. There's also things called a hybrid. It's an ESOP designed with co-op features, because for some companies, they want those ESOP tax benefits, and it's appropriate to have an ESOP for their company. They're a good fit, but they like the co-op features. So you can use a more democratic formula to allocate shares to company accounts, subject to certain ERISA testing to make sure that it doesn't inadvertently discriminate in favor of highly compensated employees. The company can have a committee of employees to participate in education and training, to receive financial information and contribute their views on policy decisions. And the bylaws can provide voting rights for all ESOP participants. It's what's called a democratic ESOP. The last thing we're going to look at very quickly are purpose trusts. And I've got employee ownership in quotes because one question we're going to ask is this employee ownership? Even though it may be called employee ownership, where are those features of ownership when you have a company owned by a purpose trust? So a purpose trust is a trust without beneficiaries, and that is allowed under state law, but the state laws are really different from state to state. Historically, purpose trusts in the United States were limited to a trust that people would establish by putting some money in trust for pet care or maintenance of grave sites. And recently, some states have significantly expanded their purpose trust statutes. This came initially from the family wealth community, because they could have purpose trusts offshore that were able to do a lot more than the purpose trusts could do in the United States. And now purpose trusts, the purpose may include social purposes that don't qualify for charitable deductions, or mission protection for a company that's held in trust. A purpose trust, let's say, if there's no beneficiaries, who is this for, and who runs this thing? So a purpose trust is administered by a trustee, advised by a trust advisor, protected by a trust protector, and these can be committees, not just individuals. And the trust protector would have be able to, say, amend the trust if necessary under certain conditions specified in the trust instrument, and enforced by a trust enforcer. And that enforcer is charged with doing just what the name sounds like. If the trust is not fulfilling or respecting its purpose, it's the role of the trust enforcer to require it to do so. And there is also ultimate oversight by a state agency, but that is limited. It's not something that you have to deal with on an ongoing basis. The history of how purpose trusts are now being used in the employee ownership context really comes from England and from Europe, and a kind of conversation between folks in England and Europe and folks here in the United States. And you can see that England has a long history of EOTs, which is what they're called in the UK. And the John Lewis Partnership has been around since 1919. The stock is held in trust for the benefit of employees, and the purpose of the trust is to protect the constitution and democracy of the company. So that's where you get that idea of the trust kind of protects the mission of the company. The business is, there's a partnership board that provides oversight of the business, and that's constituted by democratically elected members and appointed members, and they're all employees. And under current UK law, there are some significant tax advantages for EOTs. There's a capital gains exemption, capital gains tax exemption when a controlling interest is sold to an EOT, and there are tax incentives for companies to give bonuses to all employees when their company is owned by EOTs. Now, those tax benefits are specific to UK law. There's also something called steward ownership in Europe, and this is, for example, and Zeiss is one company, but there are others as well. That company is owned by a foundation, and the foundation safeguards employee rights. Very specific, like an 8-hour workday, health insurance and pension, limits on salary disparity. So you can see that you have this steward looking out for the rights of the employee. And I was talking about this with a co-op attorney who looked at me and said, "But that's not democratic. Stewardship isn't democracy." And that's true. So the extent to which a company can be stewarded and democratic is something that would be designed in the trust instrument. So what about EOTs in the US? EOTs legally are trusts under UK law and enjoying specific tax benefits there. And purpose trusts under US state laws may be called EOTs, but there aren't going to be those tax benefits for owners transferring shares to the trust or tax incentives for bonuses to employees like in the UK. And in fact, there are significant tax challenges and uncertainties. The employees are not owners of the company as they are in co-ops or beneficiaries of the trust as they are with ESOPs. And they don't receive employee ownership dividends or distributions of net earnings or the appreciated value of the stock. Democratic governance is possible, but not required. So what are the advantages? And here they are. The purpose trust can protect the mission, this is in the US, can protect the mission of the company that it owns, including favorable policies and practices for employees, that steward ownership idea, and the community. That you can write a declaration of trust that looks very similar to the values of a benefit corporation or social purpose corporation. And the company can distribute its net earnings as bonuses to employees and provide financial rewards to community stakeholders, as any company can. There's no repurchase liability like you have with an ESOP, no redemption liability like you have with a co-op, and it's not regulated. There's lower administrative costs. The owner, the trustee, has no incentive or fiduciary duty to sell the company to realize its appreciated value. Although, big caveat, survival of the company may depend on access to capital as the company grows. Some tax consequences. this is a bit. These are new structures, so there's almost no tax law, which means the guidance is going to be qualified because we're kind of figuring this out. But generally, a non-grantor trust is allowed a deduction for distributions to beneficiaries, but a non-grantor purpose trust has no beneficiaries and may be taxed on all net taxable income at a very high tax rate. So it's not tax advantaged. Trustees for a purpose trust must be in a state with favorable legislation. There are not many institutional trustees familiar with this use, but there are some, and not much guidance available for individual trustees. Obtain fiduciary liability insurance is important, and identify professionals who have some experience. There are some of us. One of the best known companies owned by a purpose trust is Organically Grown. In 2018, Organically Grown began its transition to ownership by a purpose trust. They obtained a loan from a social impact investor, also doing a preferred stock offering to help finance this. And all OGC stakeholders have a role in the trust and company structure. So it is very possible to design this to do exactly what people would like it to do, but it has to be designed into the trust and the company. The Home Care Workers Purpose Trust was created to hold ownership interests in companies in a manner that builds economic security, capacity, and social capital of home care workers. The trust advisors, protectors, and enforcers are two nonprofit organizations, ICA and PHI, and the largest worker-owned cooperative in the U.S., the Cooperative Home Care Associates. The Home Care Workers Purpose Trust owns an interest in a joint venture, and in August 2019, very recent news, that joint venture won the bid to administer the consumer-directed employer program in the southern half of Washington state. Once the program is fully transitioned, the joint venture expects to employ over 20,000 home care workers. So that's a lot of impact for that mission driven trust, and I'm very pleased and honored to say that we represented ICA in creating the trust and continue to advise in its operations. So thank you so much. We have so little time left for questions, for which I apologize. Amy, is there time for one or two questions?
Yeah, we have just a couple minutes, so we have a few that came in, and I'll try to hit some of the highlights as they came through. So one question about an ESOP: are there any restrictions to setting up an ESOP if the company is a franchise?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know the answer, but I really want to get back to you on that. And we actually have a significant franchise practice at our firm as well. I haven't worked on an ESOP franchise, but I would really like to give you an answer to that question. So if you can send me an email, I will get back to you right away.
Okay, great. We'll make sure that question gets connected to you then. Is it best to value an ESOP during good economic times versus trying to start one during a downturn in the economy?
Oh, well, your valuation is going to look over a span of time. And of course, your current value is going to be affected. If there's been a downturn, it's going to be impacted. It also, it's also going to depend on your point of view. A seller likes to get more money. A buyer likes to buy for less money. And the buyer, if the stock then appreciates, buy low, sell high, will get the upside of that benefit. So in terms of timing your ESOP, it's going to look different at different times. However, in all cases, the valuation is going to look over a span of years and take the present moment into account, of course, but we'll be looking back over time too.
Great. We are officially at 12 o'clock, so I understand if some folks need to go ahead and drop off, and thank you so much for participating today.